I'm Mark Caro, and welcome to episode 28 of Caropop. Our guest this week is renowned Nashville-based mastering engineer Ryan Smith, who has worked on recent vinyl pressings for Adele and Taylor Swift, but more notably has earned a reputation for mastering fantastic-sounding reissues. As part of my vinyl buying kick of the past few years, I joined the Vinyl Me Please record club and became familiar with this phrase: AAA lacquers cut from the original analog tapes by Ryan Smith at Sterling Sound. VMP has given Smith's name increased prominence on its releases as more and more music lovers realize that his mastering of a recording, especially from original analog elements, means that it will have an audiophile level of quality. I now own many excellent Ryan Smith mastered albums, including last year's Introducing Aaron Frazier and such VMP releases as the Isley Brothers' Go For Your Guns, Al Green's Call Me, the immortal Otis Redding, Phoenix's Wolfgang Amadeus Phoenix, Graham Parsons' Grievous Angel, and coming soon, Lyle Lovett's Joshua Judge's Ruth, and No Way by jazz guitarist Boogaloo Joe Jones. I don't even know that last album, but I'm willing to give it a shot because of who's involved. Ryan Smith is the third acclaimed mastering engineer to appear on Caropop after Bernie Grunman and Kevin Gray. Smith got a later start than those two, moving to New York City in 1995 and eventually landing an assistant engineer's job at Right Track Recording. He worked on high-profile projects with big-name producers such as Phil Ramone and Arif Mardin, but in 2002, he decided he'd rather do mastering than live recording. In this conversation, he explains why. Smith joined Sterling Sound in New York and learned his craft from the late George Marino, considered tops in the field. Digital formats still dominated in the early 2000s, but Smith became known for his vinyl mastering and lacquer cutting. And as the industry has swung back to vinyl, Smith has become increasingly in demand as a senior mastering engineer at the newer Sterling Sound facility in Nashville. He and I discuss the contrast between his work on big new releases and reissues and how he approaches each job. What distinguishes his mastering from that of his colleagues? How big a part of his job is Vinyl Me Please? Sometimes he prepares a VMP release that previously had been cut by another mastering engineer, such as John Prine's self-titled debut, which had a recent Kevin Gray version at the time. There's also a Speaker's Corner edition of the upcoming VMP release, Here Is Phineas, by jazz pianist Phineas Newborn Jr. Does Smith listen to those other versions before he does his work? How long does Smith take to master an album? His answer is different from Gray's. Does he think black vinyl albums are inherently superior to colored vinyl ones? Which is more important, where the lacquers are cut or where the albums are pressed? What does he listen to at home? How does he protect his ears? We discuss all that and much more, and his enthusiasm and expertise shine through. You should love listening to him talk almost as much as listening to those albums he has mastered. Please enjoy Ryan Smith on Caropop. Well, thank you for doing this. I really appreciate it. I've been listening to so many of your records lately that I needed to talk to the person behind them. I joined that Vinyl Me Please club right around the beginning of the pandemic, and so I get so many of these, AAA from original analog tapes, by Ryan Smith, Sterling Sound, played it at RTI, and all of that. So, and they always sound fantastic. How much of Oh, you're welcome. How much of your work is for, something like Vinyl Me Please versus for labels versus for individual artists? How does that break down?
It's a little hard to quantify just because I feel like things sort of ebb and flow all the time, and it's, but I would say maybe 30% of my work is like that reissue type stuff, like what I do for Vinyl Me Please, or a few other reissue labels who are doing like the AAA analog, super deluxe, like reissue type thing. And then, the rest of it is, I do a lot of vinyl cutting for the major labels. And then I've got a lot of just independent clients where I'm doing just digital mastering for majors as well. But probably my work is a little more indie focused than than like some of the other guys here at Sterling. Well, small labels, that sort of thing.
I think you started doing this in 2002, or maybe you were in New York in the 90s. I imagine that it's changed a lot, the business and also just like the digital versus analog and all of that. Like, tell me about sort of the progression of like when you started and, just how your work has changed over the years.
Yeah, I moved to New York in 1995 and worked initially in recording studios, not in mastering. I actually went to music school, so that's kind of how I sort of stumbled into what I'm doing now. It was just like a regular, conservatory music program. I was a saxophone player. I moved to New York. I'd spent a semester in New York in college doing a couple internships, one at a music school and one at a recording studio. And I moved back and was able to work some at that same studio. And, so I spent probably, I guess, my first 6 or 7 years, doing studio work, recording and mixing, type stuff. Mostly as an assistant engineer. I kind of helped run one of the smaller studios I worked at. Eventually, moved around through a few different studios and ended up at Right Track Recording in New York, which was one of the big commercial multi-studio facilities through the 80s and 90s. They're unfortunately gone now, as many of the big studios in New York have suffered similar fate. But when I was there, I got to work on a lot of kind of more high profile things. I got to work with a lot of kind of legendary producers, but as an assistant engineer. So that was a really cool job I had early on. And then that was what actually led to my job at Sterling. After a couple years doing the kind of the big studio thing, it was being an assistant engineer in those jobs. It's a pretty tough job. It's like it's a ton of hours and not very good pay. It's definitely like, what you would call a stepping stone job. You're paying your dues, that sort of thing. And I kind of reached a point with that job where I wasn't sure where I wanted to go next, but I knew I couldn't maintain the 80-hour weeks and, overnights and all that other kind of stuff that I was doing, for about 3 years on end. But I used to, when I could, tag along to mastering sessions for the recording and mixing projects I was working on. So like if a project would finish up and they'd be going to mastering the next day, then maybe I'd be lucky enough to get a day off, and so I would tag along. And that's how I first got in the door at Sterling and just kind of saw it. And when I reached this point where I wanted to make a change, I just kind of asked around and got to connect there with Ted Jensen, who's one of the, he's been with Sterling for a long time, like since back in the 70s, and is one of the owners now. And he actually hired me as his assistant in 2002, and it's been mastering since then. So your original impulse was to be performing music and to be playing saxophone. Yeah. I'm assuming in jazz. Yeah, I was a jazz player. I think I kind of realized early on that, that probably wasn't where I was going to end up, especially, you move to New York and you see some of the guys who can play there, and you're like, you start doing the math of like, how many hours would I have to practice to be that good? And you realize that like all of the hours would still leave me short. So I started looking for other things to stay involved in music. I still love playing. I don't do it as much anymore as I used to, but so I wanted to stay involved in music. And, I had that, I did, was able to get an internship at a small recording studio and kind of fell in love with the technological side of stuff. And, I do feel like being a musician and being a player has helped me all along. Just being able to, to talk to musicians is just, even if I can't, perform to the same level they can, just to be able to speak the same language as them. I find it very invaluable. It's just in my approach to how I do my job. Where did you grow up, by the way? I grew up a little kind of like around the Midwest. I was born in Ohio. We lived in Detroit for a while, and then Chicago. We moved to Chicago when I was about 12. That's like where my parents, my brother, and some other family are still. We're in Chicago. Since I'm in Evanston. Oh wow! My brother lives in Evanston. I grew up in Libertyville, kind of far north suburbs.
Right.
Yeah, Lake County. But yeah, my brother's in Evanston, and my mom worked in Evanston actually also. So growing up, so.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, I went to college and went straight to New York after college. So I basically, it's kind of funny because I'll tell people I'm from Chicago, but I actually I really kind of don't know Chicago that well because I grew up in the suburbs there, and so I know I kind of think of myself as from New York as much as being from Chicago, just because I was in New York for about 22 years. So.
Were you someone when you were growing up, did you listen to a lot of records, or were you more interested in playing music at the time?
Oh, no, I listened a lot. I mean, I got interested in, having like a collection. It's funny because I kind of specialized in this vinyl thing, but actually when I was growing up, I mainly had cassette tapes just because the age I'm at, it was sort of like the easy thing. The earliest things I had were records, and I had like a little I don't know if it was Fisher Price, but that type of record player, kind of like little portable that I had when I was young.
Close and play.
Yeah, exactly. And but when I was in grade school, I saved my money and I bought a boombox that had a cassette deck in it, and that was like eye-opening for me because I could tape things off the radio. Like I remember like sitting like at like in the evening, like the pop stations would have like their top 5 of the day or whatever, so you knew the hits would be played then, and I'd sit there like with the boombox and like press record at the right time, so then I'd have those. So that's kind of like my earliest memory of it. But yeah, so I really kind of grew up in the cassette and then migrated to CDs and really didn't come to vinyl till later, till I started in mastering and all that. So
what was the first album that you obsessed over?
The first album that I obsessed over. Well, let's see. Probably Thriller. I mean, I don't know if I obsessed over the album so much as I definitely had like a bit of a Michael Jackson obsession around that time. I mean, it was obviously huge. There were a few records at that time. It's kind of funny for me to look back. I kind of guess I've always kind of had tastes all over the place, but like the records I remember that were the biggest to me, like when I first got into music were Thriller and Def Leppard, Pyromania, and John Cougar, American Fool, which are kind of all over the map there, but those are like the big 3 for me when I was like, in like 4th or 5th grade. Yeah,
that summed up a big chunk of the 80s right there on covering different.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So
you just need like U2 or REM in there to cover the sort of, more guitar-y side, and you're all set. Although, the other two have them too.
And those are bands I definitely came to a bit later.
So you're in New York and you're working with, I think I'd read you were working with like Phil Ramone, Arif Mardin, Russ Titleman, those guys.
Yeah, when I worked at Right Track, I really got to work with some of the, some kind of legendary producers like that. Phil and Arif Mardin, Russ Titleman. Those guys came up making records kind of in an old school way, right? And at the time I was working there, things were really sort of transitioning toward digital recording and all that stuff. And,
right.
And, Pro Tools, I really worked at Right Track in the era when things, transitioned from analog tape to Pro Tools, like almost in that little 3-year span, where everything I was working on when I started there was on, 2-inch tape or maybe digital reel-to-reel tape. But then by the time I left, it was almost all tracking into Pro Tools. But it was really cool to work with these guys who came up through the previous era and really, made a lot of the records that, I heard growing up as a kid. And, even though they were adapting and using new technology, they still kind of had that old school kind of approach to recording. And, I feel fortunate to have seen that. And, before the complete digital transformation has, happened. I mean, the digital thing is interesting and cool. And like, the fact that people can record stuff anywhere and everywhere. But it's kind of, there aren't a lot of places that you can do that kind of recording left anymore. So I'm glad that I got to work at one, before they started to be more rare.
Did you think at the time that you wanted to be like a recording engineer where you're going to be the one setting up the mics and that sort of thing? Or did you think you wanted to also be working with the artists on like, this is the best way to arrange this, or how to, or was it always kind of like, I'm really drawn to sort of just the sound of it and making these like the most optimal recordings possible?
Yeah, I kind of thought I would be a recording engineer, like a recording / mix engineer. I definitely think I had, I think that the technical side of things suits me, and just, and I enjoyed that part of it. I enjoyed like, experimenting with, setting up microphones and placing instruments in the room and all that kind of stuff. And just, a live recording session's a pretty exciting thing, when you got, musicians sitting there and, you're doing actual takes. That's, it's exciting stuff. So that was kind of where I started from. But like I said, it was also like a pretty demanding job, and like,
right.
It wasn't a great lifestyle job. And, so I started thinking for other, looking for other ways that I could kind of use that same skill set, but in a little more controlled environment. And mastering kind of suits that, cause, it's a little more of it's the end of the road for the, the record making process. And, I feel like I had, making that move, I had a little more control over the whole process, as opposed to being at the whim of other people so much. So that was nice for me.
What was the highlight of those New York years when you were in the studio and you're seeing someone, create something in the studio? I
mean, I think anytime we had, we get to track a full band was great. I'm trying to think of a couple instances. I remember working on Christian McBride, the bass player, he brought his band in, and that was a really fun tracking session. Just incredible musicians, and just, it was a really, it was a lesson in like, it's doing those recording sessions are funny, because you're on one hand, you're really trying to get the best sound possible. So you're getting things set up just right and all that. But at the same time, there's a trick in that you got to make the musicians comfortable and allow them to perform well. And really that's got to be, as much as you want to take your job super, super seriously and do the best job possible, that has to be, has to come second after the musicians being able to perform well. Because if you get a great sounding, lousy performance, that's not really worth a whole lot. But if you get a 90% sounding great performance, that's worth a lot more. So it was, they were kind of high pressure situations, because you're trying to get that, but you're also trying to stay out of the musician's way and, make sure you get everything on tape. The worst thing you can have happen in recording studios, like when the musicians say like, "Hey, did you get that?" And then the engineer says, "Oh yeah, we weren't rolling yet," or something like that. So it's that was exciting work. And the other thing we did a bunch at Right Track was we used to do Broadway cast albums, where those were really nuts, because you would record almost the entire thing in 1 or maybe 2 days, and you'd have like a whole pit orchestra and all the singers come in and shuffle them in and out. So it was just like it was like kind of a high wire act trying to keep those sessions running. So I did really enjoy that. And if there's one thing I miss about those days, it's those like it's just those big tracking dates. And there was definitely an excitement to doing that work. Have
you met any of your musical heroes, either in the tracking dates or later, working on mastering?
Keith Richards came into my mastering studio in New York once. So that was pretty crazy. And unexpectedly, I was working with his producer, Steve Jordan, on cutting his solo record. This was probably like 4 or 5 years ago. And,
the drummer?
Steve Jordan, the drummer, yeah, who's also a producer, yeah. And I think he's probably playing drums for the Stones these days, but
exactly,
yeah. So he was producing Keith's record, and he came in. They had done the digital mastering with Greg Calby and another engineer at Sterling, and then they came in to do the vinyl version with me, and I was just working with him, and we were going to cut reference acetates and send them to Keith. I think he was in Connecticut, living in Connecticut, or he has a house in Connecticut. So we were just kind of there, and it was sort of it was cool to be working on this stuff and all that, and exciting, but it was also kind of a low key day, and there was no word that that Keith was going to come in, and at partway through the day, Jordan was out just in our lounge. I was just in the studio working by myself, and I was partway through a side, and I just turned around and my door opened and he just walked in. I was mid cut, and it was he was he hears this music and he's starts dancing around the room a little bit, and just and I'm just my jaw's on the floor. I'm I can't believe Keith Richards is in my room. And we finished the side and talked for a couple minutes, not long at all. He had some other people with him, I think his manager and some other people with him. And then he wanted to hear the little bit of the next side, so we started cutting it. And of course, I'm cutting the records. I can't stop and gawk too much. I have to concentrate on what I'm doing. And they went out back into the lounge when we were mid-side, and so I stayed there and finished it up. And when I was done, they were gone. They were it's they disappeared as fast. They're completely that was enough. He just kind of came in to check and see what was going on. But yeah, that was.
Did I just dream that, or
yeah? It exactly had a dream quality. It was that surreal. But anyway, that's probably my favorite in studio, famous musical person type story.
So you've been at Sterling since 2002. So you're at your 20 year anniversary this year. How often do musicians come in for the mastering, and how much is just you sort of working, on your own?
These days it's mostly working on our own. And of course the pandemic has just, made that even more so. But, I'd say over the years, it's definitely shifted toward, people just send us stuff, we do our work, and, either have phone conversations or email back and forth to, in terms of to talk about the work that's going to happen. A lot of that too is also the internet make it easier to move music back and forth means that our client base is spread a lot farther and wider. So, we're not necessarily working with people who are local. So, I can work just as easily with someone in Australia as I can with someone here in Nashville. And so, just because of that, it's fewer, but, I'm always happy to have people come in. I think it's nice to have, that sort of immediate connection, and also just to be able to, when I'm working on something, and if I have any questions about if I'm headed in the right direction, just to be able to turn around and say, hey, how's this sound to you? And, to have that direct, connection with the artist is nice. But yeah, these days it's a lower percentage by far. Yeah.
And you've worked on recent albums by Adele and Taylor Swift. How did you end up on those? Did they request you, and have they been involved in all? And what they what those sound like? And
my role in those records is pretty much strictly to the vinyl cutting. So one of our another engineer who I work with here at Sterling, Randy Merrill, has been doing the digital mastering on those.
Right.
What we found is that the vinyl resurgence has been interesting. I'm sure you've followed it, and it feels like people are starting to realize that the quality matters. At first, I think when vinyl started to gain popularity, people just wanted to get things out as fast as possible. They're trying to jump in the bandwagon, and there was obviously demand for it. But especially in the sort of pop rock, modern stuff world, people didn't. A lot of the knowledge of vinyl production from the past have been lost. So people were kind of relearning the whole thing. And now we've kind of got to a point where I think everyone realizes that the quality is important, and that people they're not just buying it to have a souvenir. They're actually buying it to listen to it. So, so the majors, I think now are, especially with their big records, they're requesting, people who they think they can trust to cut these records. And, so that's kind of how I've come to be cutting, some records like that. Just because, Sterling we've been cutting records since the 70s and have never stopped. So, It's obviously less than it was 30 years ago, but it's still a big part of our business, and an important part of our business. Is something that we take a lot of pride in. So
yeah, no, I was on some online forum, and it was talking about how there are different vinyl pressings of Taylor Swift's Folklore, and that you got to find the one with the RKS, which is the Ryan K. Smith one, because that was different from whatever other pressings existed.
Yeah, if you say, I'm glad to hear that. I do know sometimes, in order to get the number of records on the shelves that the labels need, sometimes they do need to spread, either the cutting or the pressing around. So I suppose that does create a situation where, there might be many iterations of the same record, either from different plants, or of course they're doing different color variants and all that kind of stuff, but also maybe it's been cut by different engineers as well. So especially these the real big pop albums, it's like it's hard for them to get enough records pressed quickly enough. If they just like 10 years ago, we maybe cut one set of lacquers for a big project, maybe two for something like artists of that popularity level. But nowadays we might cut 5, 6, 7, 8 sets of lacquers or even more. And then they're being spread around to multiple plants around, so that they can meet distribution around the world, which is kind of more similar to what it would have been, in the old days of vinyl, like where, that would have been typical to cut multiple sets and send to different plants. When vinyl was the primary format. Yeah,
the Pittman pressing versus the Terre Haute pressing or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. You see that in Discogs all the time. It's that sort of thing, right? And it's like, and so you think about it. Every lacquer cut's different. Even if you're trying to recreate it exactly, it's like some go better than others, and maybe in the pressing plant some go better than others. So yeah, there can be actually a decent amount of variation even within the same record.
Do you find with this vinyl resurgence and just all of these online communities that are digging into this, that people know who you are more now than say 5 years ago or something like that?
Yeah, I think so. I guess it's kind of strange to me. I'm still kind of getting used to it. Like, I know Vinyl Way Please usually stickers my name on a lot of the records that I cut. And I guess they're doing that because it means something to the people who are buying it, but it's a little weird to get used to. Yeah, I'm glad that people care about it and care about the quality, and hopefully I'm doing a good job. And there's a handful of other guys who are kind of doing similar work that I'm doing, and I'm glad that people are concerned about the quality and are searching out good quality, because that I think it's just good for vinyl in general. It's like if we have a bunch of not so great pressings out there that have just been kind of rushed to market, it's like it's not really going to do a lot for the format. And the better quality we get across the board, it's like it's going to make people want to keep this going and not have it just. I think 6-7 years ago, I never thought that this resurgence would continue this strong as it has. So but and I think if we keep the quality level of it up, I think people will continue to be interested. It's like if they start buying records that are that sound terrible, then they'll probably find other places to put their focus.
Are there identifiable characteristics between like what you're doing versus like a mastering job by Bernie Grunman or Kevin Gray or Bob Ludwig or someone else? I
don't know. Probably the people who listen to the records could probably answer that better. I'm just, when I do, I assume you're kind of talking about like remastering, the sort of audiophile end of the spectrum. When I'm doing those jobs, I'm hopefully working from a great source, and I'm trying to make sure I reference the original recording, and I'm just trying to, shine the best light on it possible. I don't necessarily think of myself as having like a particular style, and I don't really think of those other guys as having, a particular style either. I think that, we're all just trying to, just get the best. If you're going to do a record again, you might as well, take your best swing at, trying to make it sound the best it can. But, at the same time, respecting what was done originally as well. So
is your goal more to sort of recapture what that what it would have sounded like originally coming out of the speakers in the recording studio, or is it to maybe make it sound in your mind the best it can sound, which wouldn't necessarily be exactly how it sounded originally?
You got to take both things into account. I mean, I think that just trying to completely like flatly recreate what was done originally is maybe not the point of what people are trying to do with some of these reissues. I think that there's technological advances that have happened that, you know, I think we're able to approach cutting a little differently. It's also not like a competitive commercial format. It's like, it doesn't have to go on the radio. It doesn't have to be, you know, like a lot of records from the 60s and 70s are cut really aggressively just because, you know, they wanted to, you know, the cut through really strong on the radio, and, you know, maybe we're even EQ'd as such. And nowadays we don't have to worry about that so much. We can kind of, you know, just try to make it sound the best possible. But at the same time, you don't want to like completely reinvent the wheel. I mean, when people reissue records, it's usually records that people know well and love and all that. And if you go too far in doing something completely new, then it's like almost like you're taking maybe a little more artistic license than a mastering engineer should have. So my feeling is just to listen to the master tape and listen to the original pressing, and then try to figure out, like, you know, what's a really great presentation of this record. You know, what that's going to make it sound familiar to people, but also maybe revealing, or, you know, or just extra, you know, just super special.
There's some records that you've done that had been released, you know, with other mastering jobs, sort of in the recent past, like the John Prine self-titled debut album was Vinyl Me Please in 2021, and then, but I think there was like a Kevin Gray cut of it that Rhino had put out every year. Like, when there are two versions like that are kind of closely, you know, together, do you ever go back and listen to the other one and see what you did differently, or is that just like, no, you get the tapes, you do your thing, and don't really pay attention to the other stuff?
Sometimes if there's another reissue that already exists when I do the work, I might reference it while I'm doing my work as well. Just as another point of information for myself. I'm probably not going to go search it out afterwards and you know, I mean, maybe it could be interesting, but yeah, no. So sometimes if there have been other reissues, you know, especially if there are questions about sources or whatever, you know, I might just want to hear to try to, you know, hear what was done previously. Also, just sometimes I think it's helpful to hear the most recent version of something that was done, just because that might be, if someone's, you know, gone out and bought it recently, what did they get, and what are they going to get from me, and, you know, respectively. So I might reference it while I'm doing the work, but I'm probably not going to go out and shoot myself out against somebody else after the fact.
Well, like, for instance, like the John Prine record, did you listen to the Kevin Gray version that had come out first? And
no, I don't think I even knew that it was out, or that it had been done at the time. I just VMP sent me an original copy of the record that I referenced to, and yeah, I was aware at this point that Kevin had done a version as well, but I have not heard it. So, and yeah,
and VMP also just announced Here is Phineas, the piano artistry of Phineas Newborn Jr. And I know Speaker's Corner has a version of that one as well. So did you go back to that and listen, or is it like, nah, I'm just doing my own thing? No,
that one again, just from the original issue. I mean, usually I guess I'm not like really checking other reissues. A lot of times it might be the client who says, oh, you know, could you check this too, because we really like this. I've had that a few times with done some work for Analog Productions, and Chad Kassem, the president of there, he'll sometimes send me some of the other reissues and say like, oh yeah, we're going to do this as well, and I really, here's the original, but I really like what so and so did on this as well, so just, if you can, or maybe he'll say he didn't like it as much, and just to try to veer me in a direction one way or the other. I'm making a lot of decisions on my own, but I am still working for a client, so obviously, we're we're talking back and forth about like, you know, what sounds best. And so sometimes those reissues can be helpful in terms of like, you know, this is the direction we want to go or don't want to go.
Some of the ones you do, it'll say it's your AAA from original analog tapes. Then there'll be other ones where it'll say AAA from tapes. And then there'll be some where it's like, it's plated at RTI, but pressed somewhere else. Like which of these variables are important and which ones are just sort of like, it's nice to know, but it doesn't really make that big a difference in the sound.
All those stickers, I mean, that's like, I guess that's just the marketing department. I mean, like for VMP, for instance, we're always working from the best source that they can find available from the record companies. And, you know, I think that's important because it's like, you know, and we do get exhaustive with that. If we get something initially that we think is like, you know, there must, you know, we have a suspicion that there's something better, we'll go back and ask and have them look again. Just having the best source to start with, I think is probably the most important thing. And then, you know, people can make their own judgments about like, you know, who's the best plating house or who's the best pressing plant or whatever. You know, I think almost all the pressing plants are capable of making good records. Some just maybe have a better track record than others or do it more often. So, you know, I mean, I'm sure you follow all those forums too, and you know, they're all keeping score over who's good and who's bad and whatever. And, you know, that's kind of part of the job that's a bit out of my control because, you know, I'm not the one, you know, paying for the pressing and all that and making the arrangements. So, you know, I just hope that when it leaves my hands, it gets treated well. And, yeah, like I said, I think all these plants are capable of making good records. So, you know, I know as long as I send a good lacquer out, you know, it's got a fighting chance, and I'll let the forums decide, you know, grade them out accordingly.
Yeah, the classic coming up is No Way by Boogaloo Joe Jones, and it says, it's here on AAA 180-gram black audiophile vinyl, plated at RTI and pressed at GZ with lacquers cut from the original master tapes by Ryan Smith of Sterling Sound. So you got Sterling, you got RTI, you got GZ. People, you know, have their debates about GZ, but you know, as far as you know, I mean, it's going to sound really good because you got the original master tapes and you're doing it AAA. I mean,
I do. I mean, I like it when we can at least, like when I personally can get my stuff plated domestically, just because lacquers do have a shelf life, and you know, the longer they sit before they plate, they're going to lose some detail and potentially have problems. So, I like that VMP has found a way, you know, they think they're working with GZ because that's where they can get their records pressed on time and in the quality that they need. And so I'm glad that they have found a way to plate here in the States so that we can just get the lacquers to them faster. They've been using, I think, usually either RTI or Welcome to 79 here in Nashville, which is really convenient for me because we can have lacquers, you know, to the plating facility, you know, same day.
If you're working with like, let's say a copy of the original master, so it's a tape, but it's not the original master tape versus a really good digital version of it, is that going to make a big difference in the final product? Like, do you prefer one to the other?
It's sort of dependent on how the transfer or the copy is being made. You know, the biggest factor, if I'm not going to work from the actual original tape, the biggest factor is how that tape got transferred. So, you know, a well-transferred tape into high-res digital is probably going to sound better than a poorly transferred tape onto analog tape. So, you know, that's kind of why I prefer to be able to work with the actual tapes myself, because then I control that initial playback of the master tape, and there's different things we can do. You know, that playback is part of the mastering process. So, you know, if it's a copy and that's all we can get, then so be it. A lot of times I don't really have a lot of choice in terms of whether they're going to make an analog copy or a digital copy. And, you know, so I just hope that it's been transferred well. That's really the key there.
Well, it's interesting because I was thinking back on, you know, what are the VMP records that I think sound I mean, most of them sound really, really good. And what are the ones that sound especially kind of like popping out of the speakers? And I was thinking of the Isley Brothers, Go For Your Guns. And I looked it up, and it's pressed to QRP, which is a good place, but it doesn't say anything about AAA on that one. And I'm like, wait a minute, I thought it would say AAA because it sounds so great. But so I don't know where it's sourced from, but it sounds good on my system.
It's been a while since I cut that, but I'm 90% certain that was from Analog. I'm surprised they didn't sticker it. It's kind of funny how the stickering sometimes is like not really consistent, but you know,
right.
But
I was looking on the website just to double check it, and I didn't see it. Yeah. But now and then when you're working with new stuff, which is still obviously a major part of your business, like you got a Taylor Swift vinyl you're cutting, or Adele, or countless other indie labels and everything. How almost none of that is analog, right? I would assume that most of that has digital in the process.
Yeah, I mean, most of that's like almost completely digital. I mean, there might be analog bits in the process, but it's almost certainly been recorded digitally and mixed, to a digital format, and I'm cutting from a digital format. Yeah.
Does that feel like it's a different job from the other stuff we were just talking about?
It sort of depends. I mean, if something's been, pre-mastered by another engineer and I'm just cutting it, then that's definitely kind of a different job, because then my job really is just to get it onto disc as faithfully as possible to what they did, in the approved digital master. If I'm the digital mastering engineer myself, then I've got a little more control over it, and I'll often I'll kind of split my mastering. Like, I'll do a digital master, but then I'll do a separate vinyl master has a lot in common with the digital master, but where I've made some adjustments to do some things that I know will cut better and will sound better on disc than, a lot of times a modern digital master doesn't carry over to vinyl super well, or there are certain things that won't sound as good. So, and there are things that can kind of only be tweaked effectively if they're done like in the mastering process, not just at the disc cutting process. So when I'm mastering the full project, I'll do a separate vinyl master, to take some of that stuff into account.
Kevin Grade mentioned this too when I talked to him, how like a lot of stuff from the 60s and 70s has been EQ'd for radio play. And sometimes you just don't want it to sound like that now. So many people listen to music with like earbuds and AirPods and that sort of thing. And I don't know whether digital recordings are being mastered, a lot of them for that kind of consumption. But does it sort of change the way you approach it based on kind of how people listen these days? Or is it still a matter of like, I want the best sound out of a big set of speakers, and that's going to be the optimal, and then the other stuff will just be as it is?
All the kind of like developments in digital recording and just digital music in general, like, streaming services and all that, is definitely affects just the kind of general sound of modern like pop music. So yeah, I think that's just informed like the way, what people expect music to sound like now. So I hesitate to like, when I say I remaster for vinyl, I try to still keep it in the same vein as that digital master, because that's probably what the artist has approved with, when we've done the mastering, because that's, as popular as vinyl is, the streaming is still the thing that's going to get listened to more in most cases. So we usually start with an approved digital master. And then when I move to vinyl, I'm just sort of trying to undo some things that might not translate well onto disc, so that when it does come back off disc, it'll have more in common with the thing that they're going to hear off streaming. Yeah, it's a little tricky sometimes to get those two things to match up. And, but at the same time, just the whole, everything that happens in terms of vinyl playback is so different as well that it doesn't necessarily have to be a perfect match. By the time someone gets an actual press disc and puts it on their turntable with, whatever cartridge they have and through whatever stereo, and they're probably not going to be listening to it on AirPods when they play the vinyl version, even though they might stream it on AirPods.
Exactly.
So I mean, so there's a little bit of leeway there in terms of it doesn't have to sound like, exactly perfect, or exactly the same, between the two versions, but it's, you also don't want it to be like just a completely different beast. When people when they decide to buy something on vinyl, they probably have already heard it digitally. So you want it to sound familiar to them. And hopefully we can make some adjustments on the vinyl and kind of make a cool new experience and that's fun to listen to, and maybe more fun than just sticking some buds in your ears.
Right. Yeah. I mean, like 20 years ago when you started at Sterling, it would have all been CDs, I would imagine, at least, except for the occasional vinyl. And now CDs are sort of like, I mean, do you still think in terms of CDs for digital, or is digital really about streaming and CDs are, just more of an afterthought? Because it's still the physical product of someone who's buying the digital music as opposed to the vinyl.
Well, the digital mastering for CD versus streaming is not really a lot different. I mean, the delivery formats can be different, but in terms of the way it's treated is fairly similar. There might be a couple things you take into consideration for one format or the other, but it's not drastic. So yeah, so when I started, CD was pretty much everything. We mean, not many records in 2002 were being put out on vinyl at all. Save for club music was kind of like the kind of DJ world is kind of one of the things that kept vinyl afloat in like the late 90s and early 2000s. So it was all CD, and now it's like, we do very little, CD I mean, we deliver for CD very seldom, but but like I said, the digital master is probably the same for streaming and for that. So I think the biggest difference is that with streaming is that singles and smaller like EP type things have become much more prevalent. There's not the pressure on artists to put out an album all the time. And a lot of times, especially new artists, are putting out smaller chunks and then putting them out more often. Because I think people start realizing with streaming is you dump an album out on streaming, and if it doesn't catch anyone's attention, then there's 12 songs that, kind of just kind of get lost in the digital ether. And, or if you put out 3 songs every, 3 or 4 months, you can kind of, keep the momentum up a lot. So we see a lot of smaller groupings of songs for digital. So that's I would say one of the main differences that's happened in the streaming world.
What do you think of the CD as a format in general? Do you think that it's still for some music, sort of an optimal, format, or do you think, I'd rather listen to an old record than any CD at this point?
I mean, I think CD has potential. I think it's, I think with a lot of digital stuff, there's things that you can do digitally that aren't necessarily ideal for how things sound if you're thinking of it from a more like purist audiophile standpoint. And I think CDs can sound really good, but I mean, at this point, I've got a ton of CDs, but I listen to my vinyl a lot more often. It's I don't know. It's more, there's something about vinyl that's more fun.
Right. I agree.
I mean, maybe it's the size of the disc. When I really started getting into it at home, I started, after coming from a CD and, I started with cassettes, but really, like through the 90s was just a CD collector. I didn't have vinyl at that point. And when I transitioned into listening to vinyl, for at home and whatnot, I really started to appreciate like the idea of two sides. I mean, it's
right.
Like a 20-minute plus or minus 3-4 minute side length is like, it's a really perfect sort of amount of music to consume in one sitting. And then it kind of gives you this option of like, okay, you can go flip the record over and listen to some more of this, or maybe you've had enough of this and we're going to move on to something else and listen to another side of another record. That used to drive me crazy in this, because CDs had, you could go up to like 80 minutes on a CD. And so just because you could, a lot of people did. So you'd end up with a lot of like, over hour long CDs. And I remember just having so many where I would be like, man, I never listened to songs 14, 15, and 16. Because I never get there. It's like, I'm done by that point. So I really I think that the LPs are really all the proportions kind of work out really well, I think, for people's attention spans and what you want to take in a given amount of time.
Yeah, there's something to be said for the 40-minute album as a unit of music. It's just like just about the right amount.
It really is. It really is. Yeah.
So you grew up with CDs. What was it that flipped the switch for you into, from digital into analog and, CDs into records?
So I started working at Sterling in the early 2000s, and like I said, it was all digital at that point. And at first I was assisting Ted Jensen, and then I eventually started assisting George Marino, who's another one of the kind of original Sterling engineers. And that was
kind of a legendary guy, right?
Yeah, very much so. In the late aughts, we started to kind of get the inkling that vinyl was going to have this bit of a comeback. Never would have guessed it would get to where it is here in 2022. And at that time we got a line on, at that point Sterling we were down to one lathe. We had one guy cutting for us. And, like I said, it was mostly like club music, DJ type stuff. So around this time we kind of sensed, the vinyl was sort of picking up. And so we got a line and bought a second lathe, and, George was into sort of the twilight of his career, and he he'd grown up, he'd been cutting records since 1968, but then hadn't been for about 7-8 years, just because there was the demand for it wasn't there. So we got the lathe, we installed it in his studio, which I was sharing with him at the time. So that's the point where he taught me how to cut, as when we bought that second lathe. Yeah, so that's kind of when I started to kind of get into all of it. It was at that point when all of a sudden the studio that I was using had a lathe in the corner, and I was like, hey, you got to show me how to use that thing. And so I was really fortunate to get to learn to cut from him, someone who, it was almost hard for him to teach me because it was so ingrained for him and sort of this sort of automatic that how do you explain to someone how to ride a bike? It's like you can't really explain it. It's just sort of a feel thing. And I think, cutting records is almost like that, automatic for him. But he did teach me, and it's a big learning curve learning how to cut discs. So it definitely took a while, like I always say, it's really easy to cut a record, but it's really hard to cut a good record. You can teach someone someone with some technical skill can learn how to, to operate the lathe and, cut something in, relatively short period of time, but to cut something that, that sounds good and that takes into consideration all the, the different aspects of the format, it takes a while.
So what are the things that you're learning when you're learning how to cut, a really great record?
Well, you got to know the things that don't work or don't work well on vinyl. So, like sibilance is a big one, and knowing how to, like the S sound in people's vocals, but also sometimes like it can be really bright cymbals or some instrument like a muted trumpet, things like that have that real kind of, piercing high frequency content. If you just try to cut it as is, a lot of times it'll, when it plays back, it sounds really bad. Sounds distorted. There's some issues with the low end in terms of the bass being in phase or out of phase, so you have to learn about. And then you have to also learn, like, physically what a good cut disc looks like. So we have a microscope when we're done cutting, and we can look at the groove that we've cut on the lacquer disc and inspect it before we send it out. And there's all sorts of things that can happen. It's a really, when we say it's analog, it's analog. It's a real physical thing. It's, something as stupid as like a bit of dust falling down the lacquer and getting dragged by the cutting stylus can ruin a cut or give a cut problem. So you have to be on the lookout for all those sorts of things. And then, so that's like sort of the real technical stuff that you learn early on. And then there's a lot of trial and error with how you decide on what level to cut things at and the EQ you choose. We do a lot of test cutting. So a lot of times when I'm working on something, I'll be listening and making adjustments, EQ and level and whatnot. And I get to a point where I'm pretty sure I like it. so then I'll do a test cut. So I'll take a scrap lacquer or just an extra lacquer and cut a bit of the music or maybe the whole program, and then listen to it back and maybe even on a couple different turntables to see how it comes back. Because sometimes, I mean, music's it's kind of weird how sometimes things that you think are just going to sound fine, and then you hear them back on disc, and for whatever reason, the frequency content in them comes back sounding a little off, or for one reason or another. So you have to go back to the drawing board a little bit. A lot of times I feel like finding sort of a sweet spot for the level that you cut things at, in terms of like how loud it is in the disc. If you get it too low, it's not, it might be cleaner, but it lacks like a little certain like excitement and magic. But then if you get it too loud, then it'll start to break up. So you got to kind of find that kind of sweet spot in the middle where it's where it kind of jumps off the disc, but it doesn't jump too hard and break up. So yeah, there's a bunch of stuff like that, and the longer you do it, you can kind of anticipate that stuff faster from experience. But even then, it's like I still do quite a bit of test cutting just to make sure that I'm certain that what comes back off the disc is going to be what I intended and what the artist wanted and all that.
I would imagine that you have to do your job. You have to have a lot of faith and confidence in your ears, and you're like, yeah, I'm hearing this the way I need to hear it. And you can't be second guessing yourself all the time, because it just seems like you could drive yourself crazy and be like, well, which EQ is better, this one or that one?
Yeah, no, for sure. And for mastering engineers, our studios are super important for us. And, like recording engineers, mixing engineers, maybe not so much mixing engineers, but might move around to different studios a lot, depending on the artist they're working with and the projects they're working on. Mastering engineers really don't do that. We have our own rooms, and we've got them dialed in, and we, a big part of the job is just like listening and knowing your setup really well, and knowing what music that sounds good coming out of the speaker sounds like. I mean, that sounds kind of basic, but it's really like, right. You really got to know that. And then once you realize that you've kind of learned that, is then trusting it and not second guessing. Like if it sounds wrong coming out of these speakers, then something's wrong. That's like, I'm confident of that. And, so yeah, so we do, I mean, another part of just of learning this job is just, hours and hours of listening, and, I've said this to people before. It's like you just kind of get to a point where you learn what a finished record sounds like, and so you're sort of working to that end.
Are you using equipment that was there when George Marino was cutting stuff? Are you using new equipment? Is it a combination of new and old?
A combination. A lot of the stuff's the same as what he had. I've got a great technical department here at Sterling that does tinkered under the hood of a lot of our gear, to modify it a little bit. But yeah, I mean, some of the stuff I have is, has been with Sterling for 30 plus years. And then I also have some things that are new, and some things that are the techs have built specifically for the room and for our cutting system. We do spend a lot of time always thinking about ways we can upgrade. And upgrade, we're not like necessarily looking for like a new EQ or something, or a new compressor or something like that. We're looking more for like how we can, improve the signal path, at every stage, and just so what we hear coming out of the speakers is really what ends up on the disc.
You've done a bunch of these country music releases for VMP, and then the classics as well. So the classics tend to be your kind of 50s, 60s, 70s, blues, jazz, soul. The country is country. A lot of it has been sort of, kind of 70s, really great AAA of Willie Nelson's Shotgun Willie and that sort of thing. The country stuff so far has been on, and I really like the Graham Parsons Grievous Angel, by the way. The country stuff has been on colored vinyl. The classics has been on 180 gram black vinyl. Do you think there's a difference in those two vinyls, or is it really, if you master it right, it's going to sound great no matter what?
Well, I wouldn't say it's going to, that's a tricky question. Colored vinyl can certainly sound great, but, I mean, this is probably a better question for a pressing plant person, but my instinct is that every press operator knows how to run a black record. You know, all the PV, it's all PVC, and it's all just, you know, pigments that they put into it, but the pigments change the way the plastic melts in the press and all that. And so I think different, you know, from what I understand, different colors and different, you know, sometimes if it's a swirl or a, you know, splatter, all those kind of things, it might take some more tinkering to get it right in terms of, like, you know, the temperature they operate the press and, you know, the cycle times and all that other stuff. So, you know, I think you can make a good sounding colored vinyl, but, you know, but black is like kind of like a sure bet. And like I said, like everyone who runs a press knows how to press a black record, because that's, like, you know, what records were for years and years. And years. I think I get nervous whenever it's like a multicolor situation, just because it feels like, I mean, I know that, you know, the consumers like that stuff, and it does look really cool, but I get nervous that it's gonna, you know, that it's gonna get noisy. It's not gonna affect like the sound of the record. It's really just whether it's gonna be noisy or not. And you know, I think the colored stuff can sometimes be trickier to press well.
Yeah, when I was growing up, you know, occasionally you get a colored vinyl record. Like I have a yellow copies of like Asia and Royal Scam, Steely Dan, and I think a pink copy of Animals. I think it was French pressing of Animals that I somehow found at some point. Yeah. But, you know, but now it's like, you know, it's just these splatters and these patterns, and, you know, and they're, you know, they're really pretty. You know, they look like peacock feathers sometimes, but I'm always like, you know, am I better off just getting, you know, I'm like, there's a reason those classic ones are just, you know, the sort of the more audiophile ones are black and 180 gram too. That's important too, right?
Yeah. I think that
the heavier.
There's no reason 180 grams not going to make the record sound better, but you know, a well-pressed standard weight vinyl will sound just as good. But there's something about I think there's something about the 180 gram that, like, it just kind of feels more sturdy in your hand. I don't know. I think that some of that's
solid.
Yeah.
Probably less likely to warp.
Yeah. I think that's the case.
How often do you get in the studio to, you know, master something and you play it and you get goosebumps? You're like, oh my God, this sounds so amazing. You know, I need to really, you know, do not that you're not bringing your A game anyway, but this one is really special. It's like making me, you know, remember why I love music. I
mean, yeah, it definitely happens fairly often. I mean, you know, it probably happens more often when it's music that I already know. You know, one of the cool things about working for VMP has been they choose a lot of sort of off the beaten path stuff. So a lot of times I'm working on things that I didn't know before, and then I get to, you know, to learn and be introduced to new stuff. But yeah, when you work on something that's like that I already like I'll use like I've been doing a lot of these jazz reissues on the acoustic sound series for Universal Verve. And so I get to do a bunch of John Coltrane records, which are records that I knew really well. So, like, you know, when I got to cut Love Supreme, you know, I mean, that was like, you know, I mean, it's like a record I freaked out over and obsessed over when I was in high school. And, you know, it just, yeah, it's a few others like that. A lot of those jazz records, I was like, sometimes I had to kind of like pinch myself, being like, I can't believe that this is my job to, you know, to handle these tapes that are, you know, so old, and this music that I love so much. And like this reel of tape was in the room with those guys when they recorded it. You know, it's like all this, you know, like they were at, you know, at Rudy Van Gelder's studio or wherever it was recorded. And like, you know, they were there. It's like, it's pretty crazy. Is
a new version of a tape that's been around for decades. Can you still make it sound better than the original, or like which has the advantage, like a pristine original of something, or the modern technology applied to, you know, what's an older tape by this point?
I mean, I hope that we can do something a little better just because the technology has improved. But it's not always the case, because sometimes, you know, the tapes have deteriorated, or, you know, and sometimes when things are done really great, the old stuff, if it's done really, really well, it's hard to beat. think in a lot of cases we're able to reveal more that was on the tape than they were able to. Just lathes have gotten better, the cutter heads, our tape machines are a little more advanced. Our signal path is hopefully cleaner and all that sort of thing. So hopefully we're able to get a little more detailed version on the disc. But there are some that are old, some old ones that are just like, I mean, they just had some kind of magic going, and you're just hoping that you can get something that sounds as good.
Have there been any that you've just been especially intimidated by, where you're just like, oh, I don't know how I'm going to top what's already come out on this one?
Nothing that really comes to mind. I mean, I definitely know that there's some where I'll hear the original and I'll just be like, I just need to make it sound like this because this sounds right. And so I'm not like really like, wouldn't say intimidated, because I usually feel like I can at least get there. But like, if the original just sounds like just kind of perfect, then why would you want to? It's like all I want to do is just be like, well, let's just have it so that there's more of these records in the world available to people, because there's only, right, especially when you deal with a record from like the 60s or 70s, there's only so many of them left, and of those, there's only so many of them that aren't beat up. So and it's nice when people can go to a record store or buy something online that's new, and as opposed to like having to go on Discogs and spend like $150 for an original pressing of something that may or may not come as graded by the Discog seller and all that. There's not a lot of those out there. I mean, so it's nice to be able to put fresh records into the world that sound great, and for some of this fantastic music that's been out of print since.
You ever get a recording to master and you're just like, I hate this too much, I can't even do it, and someone else needs to do this one, I can't stand it?
I don't know if I've ever gotten quite that far, but I've definitely had the feeling of wanting to say that. But I do feel like I'm a professional, and I have to, if someone hires me to do a job and I've agreed to do it, I should take it to completion. I've had situations where people maybe were, me and the artist or the producer didn't see eye to eye on where things came out, and so I've bowed out on things before in that sense. But and yeah, it's part of the nature of being a mastering engineer, that you're going to work on, some days you're going to work on things you love, and some days you're going to work on things that aren't to your liking so much. I feel like I've got a fairly broad taste, and I think that's helpful. I think part of my job is sort of like finding a way to like things, even if it's just for an afternoon, just to try to find the thing that you like in it, so that you can, so you can do the best job possible. If you're really hating on something, it's really hard to do a good job.
I think there would be sort of two factors like that. One would be if you can't stand the music, and the other one is if you think the recording just came out wrong, and it's just like it's badly produced or engineered or mud or whatever, and you're like,
yeah. I mean, I always say with mastering that mastering can run in two directions, like either where you're handed something that sounds really good to begin with, and you're just trying to like shine it in its best light, enhance it a little bit, shine it up a little bit. And then the other end of the spectrum is things that come in with problems. And then your job is to try to save the day, to try to like find something to make it sound, at least like it's half decent when it comes out. So, I mean, those jobs can kind of be interesting too, because it's, it becomes sort of a challenge of like, how can I make this at least listenable? It's frustrating though sometimes when you hear stuff where you like the music, but maybe the recording or the production up till it got to you, is not it's not great, and it can be frustrating if you're like, man, this could have been really something, but yeah, you do your best with it, and yeah. Just trying to make it sound as good as you can get. Do
you have any that you would say, if someone said, oh, I want to hear like your best work or something like that, is there something that comes to mind that you would point to?
One thing I always use like as sort of like, like if people come in and want to hear something in my studio on, my big fancy speakers and all that. There was a Paolo Nutini record that I did about 5 or 6 years ago that I often play for people, just because I think it's a modern production. So it's like kind of got like, it sounds, it's not like old school audiophile, but it's really well done. And, they didn't make us, overdo it with the compression and all that. Like they do, like is often the case with modern stuff. And then for vinyl stuff, I mean, I am pretty happy with some of these jazz things that I've done recently, like the reissue stuff. Like I mentioned Love Supreme before. We did a version of Oliver Nelson's Blues and the Abstract Truth that I think came out really, really great. I mean, a lot of those, it's like, I almost feel like I'm cheating by taking a lot of credit for it because they're just great recordings. And it's like, I mean, I'm hopefully adding a little bit to it, but it's some of it, sometimes it's just getting out of the way and getting it cut to disc as best as possible so that, what was the hard work that was done by those musicians and engineers originally can be heard properly.
How many records are you mastering in a week or a day or whatever?
Typically, like, an album a day is sort of standard, sort of pace. But like I said, these days with a lot of smaller configurations, singles and all that. So we're always kind of cobbling together the schedule. So one day I might be doing a full album and the next day I might be doing a handful of singles or like, 2 EPs or something like that.
What do you do to protect your ears?
It's funny. I stopped doing it since the pandemic because I wasn't going out at all. But for a while, what I was doing is I had a little, I got like these like $30 earplugs that are like, they're not quite as nice as the ones that you get molded to your ears, but they're like kind of in that vein. So like they're supposed to like, let the sound through relatively flat, but reduced by enough that, that you protect yourself. And I would just try to keep those in my pocket all the time so that if I ended up someplace loud, I could pop them in. And that was followed by years of like, going out to shows in New York City and forgetting to do that. And then like ending up like, wadding up, paper towels in my ears, like in the bathroom between sets or whatever to try.
I used to do that with toilet paper. Yeah.
Yeah. So
you could actually buy earplugs.
Yeah. So I was doing that for a long time, but it works okay in terms of like, blocking out the sound, but it doesn't make going to the show very enjoyable. So yeah, I found there's several companies that make these earplugs that, they're about $30 or something like that. And so they're not so expensive that if you lose them, you get mad. Cause I thought about getting, you can get like molded ones that like, that fit specifically to your ears, but they cost like, $300 or $400. And I'm like, yeah, if I lose those, then I'm going to be really mad. So, and I don't go out to shows a lot. So that's probably, as much as anything. I try not to listen too loud at home, try to keep my volume intact in the, or in control in the studio. I talked about like knowing the studio really well is like part of that is like, for me, I've got like a mark on my volume knob where it sits all the time. So, so that I'm always listening at the same volume and I know it's a safe volume. And, even when sometimes you get tired, you start wanting to turn things up just because your ears are tired and it feels like, you get the sense that things are quieter, but, kind of having that mark there just to know like, yeah, if you want to turn things up, you're probably tired and you probably should just go home and take a break.
Lately, it's like because I haven't been to as many shows, going to like a movie, sometimes like the trailers and stuff, you're like, whoa, maybe I should have brought my earplugs for this. But, but yeah, usually it would be the, like the loud concert where you'd sort of stand close to the stage and you're like, yeah, I better put something in there.
It hasn't been such an issue since the pandemic. It's like I've been out to like, 2 shows in the last 3 years, it feels like.
How much of a difference does it make a difference for you that you're based in Nashville instead of like LA or New York?
No, I guess it definitely factors in. I mean, because you're always, there are always people who want to, to come into the studio. Like I said, it's been less in the last couple of years, but in general. So, I mean, I definitely do more work from Nashville now that we're here. I don't feel like I've really lost work from New York from moving away from Nashville, but that's just because, of having built up clientele there during the years that I was there. I mean, I think it's I do more work with the Nashville community than I did in when I was in New York. I suppose, just us coming here and, getting to know people, word of mouth gets around, and so you end up gaining some new clients. So that's been fun. Nashville's a great city, and, there's just an unbelievable amount of music going on here. So I've been really happy with the move. It's kind of interesting because obviously there's tons of music in New York, but there's tons of everything in New York. And so music feels like, even though there's a lot of it going on there, it also feels like kind of a small slice of like the kind of business of the city in general. But in Nashville, there's, a ton of music, but it's one of the main, the main industries here. So it just feels like it's kind of cool living here, because you feel like you run into people who are in the music business everywhere in all facets of life. And that's been a really kind of cool thing. It feels like there's a real like kind of community here, where in New York it's a little more spread out. And, New York's its own beast. I still love it, but, glad for a new chapter of our life too. So
thank you so much, Ryan. I really appreciate it. I've really enjoyed listening to your work. When you come back up to Chicago, let me know.
Yeah, I will. Yeah. Thanks for having me. I've listened to a couple of your episodes in the last couple of weeks, and it's a cool podcast.
Oh, cool.
I just listened to part 1 of your Steve Albini interview on the weekend, and I'm itching to listen to part 2. That was a really cool one. I enjoyed that. Yeah.
Part 1, I was actually in the studio, and then he had to sort of break. And so part 2 was done like this, and so it was that's why there were 2 parts of it. But it was cool being in there. If you want to master some modern analog stuff, just come get in a partnership with him. So
yeah. I've done a couple things that he worked on, but not a lot. I'd love to do more. I mean, I love the fact that he's still doing everything fully analog. It's pretty incredible and rare these days.
Good talking to you, Ryan. That's it for episode 28 of Caropop. Thanks so much to Ryan Smith for his insights and excellent work. You can book mastering sessions with him at Sterling Sound in Nashville at sterling-sound.com. And look for his RKS and the dead wax of such final releases as Taylor Swift's Folklore and Adele's 30, as well as numerous jazz, soul, blues, rock, and country reissues, many from Vinyl Me Please. Thanks to the Caropop team, including web developer Marty Rosenbaum and Lou Carlozzo, who recorded the Caropop theme. Caropop is produced by Chris Swake, whose work is forever sterling. I'm Mark Caro. Please follow me on Twitter at Mark Caro, at MarkCaro, and at Caropop1, and visit the Caropop website, caropop.com, for posts about music, movies, food, and also this Caropop podcast. Thanks.